Although South Africa is a secular state, various religious beliefs and practices continue to influence societal thinkings and norms. But from time to time, you encounter a story so outrageous, it borders on the unbelievable, and it often emanates from the infrequently mentioned world of the occult and satanic practices. Director at the Wits Centre for Diversity Studies, Professor Nicky Falkof, has written extensively on this topic and talks to us now about it. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. So we're talking about cults. I just want you maybe to start off by speaking to us whether there is a prevalence of cults in South Africa.
That's the big question, really, isn't it? If you follow tabloid news or you spend a lot of time on social media, you may begin to think that South Africa has a particular problem with occult crime, that we are simply awash with cults and Satanists and witches and all sorts of other nefarious, supernatural and dangerous beings and practices. My research suggests this is not the case at all. What we do have is we have a tendency to diagnose different types of violent crime as being a consequence of the occult. So we're no more beset with supernatural danger than any other country that has, a particularly rich and robust religious tradition. We can think here of the US, which has a big problem with cults and issues of so-called occult issues. We can think of Brazil, which has the same scenario. But in South Africa, we talk about the occult so much, we worry about the supernatural so much, that in many ways our understandings of violent crime are filtered through these pre-existing belief systems. And that has a lot of very worrying consequences for how we talk about and deal with crime.
So speaking about that, Prof, do we have a clear classification then of some of these crimes and whether this is occult or not, and really just the impact and the influence of these on our societies? I think in what you have penned in your book, The Devil Made Me Do It, Satanic Panic and 5 Occult Crimes That Gripped South Africa's Imagination, you make mention of the Prophet of Doom and how some of those practices are not necessarily seen as occult.
The Prophet of Doom and other, what I call exploitative or abusive pastors, are a massive problem in this country. We have an entire commission that's been designed by the state to keep an eye on issues of religion and indigenous magic and indigenous practices and belief systems. And they agree that these kinds of pastors are hugely problematic because they do things like making promises that they can't possibly keep. For example, spraying you in the face with a can of doom will cure you of cancer or AIDS, or drinking petrol will make you rich. And what does all of this do? It allows these particular people to, often financially and without question in terms of status, enrich themselves to the detriment of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society. So while it may not seem that something like the Prophet of Doom saga is an issue that belongs in a book about so-called occult crime, I've defined it this way because what these kinds of abusive and exploitative pastors are doing is they are manipulating people's very powerful and deeply held belief systems for personal gain. There's another story in the book of a so-called, of a murder of a woman. It's a terrible, terrible story, a murder of a mother by her family members, because they decided that she had been possessed by a demon and needed to be exorcised. And, it's a tragic, tragic story, but they didn't come up with this on their own. One of the family members was taught how to exorcise people by the church that she attended. The church has some responsibility towards this kind of violence when they are telling people, go and perform exorcisms that require physical violence and may end in harm or death. And yet we look at churches, because they are churches, as though they are beyond critique and beyond analysis simply because they're religious, and we tend to be a very religious society.
And what we often see in the headlines, it's with regards to some of those ritual killings and the mutilations of bodies. Do we also classify many of those as occult crimes? And are we finding that the prevalence of such crimes is because of such, like you mentioned, when the advice is coming from a church or from a healer or someone of that kind of authority within a community, in order for people to be able to commit such crimes?
Well, there are a couple of very important points here. So firstly, often when a crime is defined as occult, it's defined as occult because there is so-called occult paraphernalia in its wake. So we often hear stories of young people who have been harmed or even killed by other young people. And these crimes are then defined as occult because you will find a black candle or a pentagram, or the school will be awash with rumors of Satanism. And we then all decide that we now understand why this crime happened, because these children were Satanists or there was Satanism in the school, and that's what we need to deal with. And when you dig a little deeper, you often find that the perpetrators of these kinds of violence, while they themselves may have thought they were performing a satanic ritual, firstly, they often get their information from YouTube videos or bits of narrative that are passed around via social media. None of this is very coherent, or possibly from within church groups or from spiritual leaders. None of this is very coherent. None of it suggests, there is no evidence to prove that there's any kind of large-scale satanic conspiracy. But secondly, when you look at the people who perpetrate this kind of crime, especially when they're young, what you often find is histories of poverty, alcoholism, and intrafamilial abuse, right? So these are young people coming from very precarious communities and situations with very precarious and abusive personal backgrounds. And the likelihood is that the reason that they are drawn to such extremes of violence, and the reason that they are capable of such extremes of violence, is because they have had really, really troubling and difficult upbringings. They have not had the kind of support, the kind of nutrition, the kind of education, the kind of emotional input that they needed in order to help them grow into productive members of society. But instead of looking at any of that and trying to understand all of those social causes and motivations for crime, because there was a pentagram at the crime scene, we just shrug our shoulders and go, okay, well, I guess it was satanic. We just need to pray in schools more, as though that could possibly be the answer to why a 16-year-old girl is capable of murdering another 16-year-old girl in close, intimate proximity with a knife.
And Prof,
The way that we talk about these crimes is not helping us to understand how they happen.
true. And is that then why we're seeing a growth of some of the violent crimes in the gangs that also seem quite occult?
This is, again, a really important question. And there is another fantastic scholar, I think at UWC, who's been doing a lot of research lately into occult and muti symbolism amongst gangs in the Western Cape. And I think in that instance, what you have is very similar. You have people who are drawn to an iconography, a set of stories that they are told will help them gain power. Again, there's absolutely no evidence that what is making these gangs successful, if success is how you want to define it, is the use of muti or occult practices or anything supernatural at all. But those signs and symbols are very frightening. They make the people enacting the violence feel more powerful. They make the people at risk of the violence feel more vulnerable. They make the communities assailed by the violence feel like they have less agency to try and resist it. So in the same way that stories around the 26s, 27s, and 28s, these older narratives around gangs and gang power became frightening in and of themselves once people understood what they mean, gang adoption of occult symbolism is basically a way for people involved in these kinds of things to feel as though they are more frightening and to actually be more frightening to the people that they prey on.
Well, Prof, this certainly does call for us to sort of peel this onion even more with regards to understanding the thinking behind many of the crimes that we experience within our communities. Thank you so much for your time.